Hi, I'm James Nelson, Vice Chairman of Cushman & Wakefield, and I'm here to bring you the Nelson Report's March 2017 video exclusive. Today, I'm here with Seth Pinsky, who's the EVP of RXR's Emerging Markets Group. He was also formerly the president of the NYC EDC under Mayor Bloomberg, and also the director of their special initiative for rebuilding after Sandy. Seth, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Seth, I've been really impressed. I've learned a lot hearing from you on the past about New York's affordability crisis and what it's going to take to solve this. So maybe you could tell us a little bit. It seems to me that there's been a ton of prosperity since 9/11, since Sandy, a lot of great work you did at the Bloomberg administration. And yet today, it seems that New Yorkers, there's some real dissatisfaction when it comes to the subject of housing. Can you talk a little bit why there is this disconnect?
Yeah, it's interesting. In a lot of ways, what we in New York are suffering from are the symptoms of success. If you think back to September 11th, the city was really facing an existential crisis where people weren't sure if the city would be able to recover. We did recover, and then we had the body blow of 2008 and the collapse of Lehman Brothers, again, questions about the viability of the city, and then yet again with Hurricane Sandy. And the amazing thing about New York is after each one of these crises, we were able to come back, and not just come back to the level that we had been before, but even stronger. And so today we have record population, we have record employment, we have record visitorship. All of the macroeconomic indices are positive. Mm-hmm. The challenge, though, that we're facing in New York is that as all of that prosperity has continued, and that prosperity in turn has driven demand, our supply hasn't kept pace. So we're not producing enough housing to meet the growth in our population. We're not producing enough office space to meet the growth in employment. And by the basic rules of economics, when supply and demand become imbalanced, what has happened is that prices have risen. And so the challenge that we're facing today is that people are finding it difficult to afford to live in New York, even though more and more people want to be here. And in particular, and this is very important, this problem is a grave problem at the low end of the income spectrum. It's impacting all New Yorkers, there's no question about it. And it's certainly harder for the middle class to afford to be in New York than it was historically. But where it truly is at crisis proportions is among low-income New Yorkers.
Mm-hmm. That all makes a lot of sense. And the current administration's Housing New York initiative, I'm sure its aim was to tackle some of these issues. Have they been successful, and how would you change or expand on that plan?
Well, look, the mayor, I think, deserves a lot of credit for a couple of things. First of all, he's given voice to a number of the challenges that New York is facing that perhaps the general public wasn't as focused on. And I think focusing people and their energies on tackling those challenges is something that is very important. You can't solve a problem unless you first identify that the problem exists. I think the mayor also deserves a lot of credit, especially on the housing front, for being very aggressive. His 200,000 unit goal, 120,000 units preserved, 80,000 new units, is an enormous undertaking. And to date, he's been quite successful in meeting the goals that he's set for himself.
Right. But are those new units that have been created, or some of those?
Well, it's a mix. But I think that what's important in evaluating the success of his initiatives is not just whether he's hitting the milestones that he's set for himself. And again, they're important milestones, but whether those milestones are the right milestones and or whether they're the complete set of milestones. And the argument that I would make is that what the mayor is doing is an important part of the solution set, but isn't the entirety of the solution set. And what I mean by that is a few things. First of all, affordability, which is really the issue that we're facing, is determined by a ratio. It's the ratio of incomes to cost. Income is an important part of this issue. The problem is not just that housing is too expensive, the problem is that people aren't earning enough to afford it. And so we need to have as aggressive an economic development agenda as we do an affordable housing agenda. In addition to that, we have to recognize that the crisis in affordability that we're facing today affects different people differently. Not surprisingly, wealthy people are generally not that impacted by the affordability crisis. People in the middle class are, but to an even greater extent, people at the low end of the income spectrum are really in crisis. And if I had one bone to pick with the mayor's approach to affordable housing that I think is the most significant one, even with changes that the mayor has recently made, I think that the mayor is not focusing enough on where that crisis is today. They're not, in a world of limited resources, which is the world that we exist in, to the extent that we're spending significant sums of money on trying to address the problem, we should be focusing on where the problem is most intense.
Right. No question at all. And when they recently reported that for the Domino Sugar project, for the 104 units that they had created, there was 87,000 applications. So clearly there's a great need here. So how do we go about creating this affordable housing?
Well, and I think you raise a really important point. And the point is that even if you want to focus exclusively on the cost side of the equation and you put income off to the side, which again I would argue you shouldn't, but let's do that for a minute. On the cost side, you can't solve this problem by creating government subsidized, rent regulated housing. And that's not because doing so is not important, or even that doing so is a bad thing. If it's targeted towards the right populations, it's actually an important part of the solution. The problem, though, is that what we have is a fundamental imbalance in supply and demand. Even at 200,000 units, as the mayor's plan currently stands, over 10 years, that represents a tiny fraction of the overall supply. We have over 3 million units of housing. Adding the 80,000, which are the new units in that 200,000, to that 3 million unit supply over 10 years is barely going to make a dent. And therefore, the real solution to this problem comes with more development. And although I understand why people in many neighborhoods don't want to see higher density in their neighborhoods and why people are very protective of the character of their neighborhoods, the bottom line is you cannot be pro-affordability and anti-development.
Right. That's a great point. So maybe talk a little bit more about public-private partnerships to spur some of this development. Talk about the new 421A program as it's being proposed. Will this help create more of this housing that's so desperately needed?
Well, I'll start with 421A. Because we have a tax system, a real estate tax system, which frankly is a bit of a mess, we need Band-Aids to make certain types of development possible. And 421A is one of those Band-Aids. In an ideal world, you would start over, you would reform the tax system, and you probably wouldn't need a program like 421A. So I understand why there's an argument to be made that 421A is important. I think, though, that the way that it's been proposed and is currently envisioned to be structured, it's going through the legislative process now, I think there are at least a couple of questions that are worth asking about it. The first is it going to result in housing that not only is affordable in name, but is affordable in fact? And are we actually encouraging developers to choose options where they're creating the kinds of units that are directed at, again, that population that is most in need? Low income, very low income, extremely low income New Yorkers. The second question is about the length of the tax abatement, 35 years. And again, there are arguments for why you need to extend it if you're going to be asking more from developers on the affordability side. But I do think it's important for us to evaluate the opportunity cost of those lost tax revenues, because for every dollar that we're abating taxes in order to get these affordable units, that represents a dollar that at some point in the future we're not getting for education, we're not getting for parks, we're not getting for health and hospitals. And those are also important parts of the equation in terms of addressing affordability. So again, it's hard to say whether the 421A proposal or 421A generally is a good program or a bad program, but it's important that as the legislature advances the program that they ask the right questions and do the right analysis.
Right. So we'll see later this month when, as I know it is in the state's budget, which I think they're set to vote on March 31st, and we'll see if they do accept it as is or make adjustments. So, well, you make a lot of great points there. Just in closing, maybe you could talk about what your firm RXR is doing now here in the city, in the boroughs, and in the suburbs, and maybe tell our audience a little bit about how you view the city compared to the suburbs. Do they now compete, or how do you look at that?
The city and the suburbs do compete, but they should be complementary. And the reason for that is that this affordability crisis that we're facing is a crisis that fundamentally is based on a mismatch between supply and demand. And the place where that mismatch exists is in the city. Population in the city is growing faster than we're able to create new housing. The answer to that problem has to be more development. Mm-hmm. The challenge that we're facing in New York City is, again, understandably, when you go from the theoretical discussion about development to the specific discussion, you say, I want to build a building this big in this neighborhood, it affects people. Mm-hmm. And it's hard politically to get the kinds of changes that are necessary through the political process. So the only answer, if we want to create enough new supply to meet the demand, is to spread that supply out. But we have to do it in a way that isn't like we used to do it, which is just by creating suburban sprawl. What we need to do is we need to do it in a way that's intelligent, that's focused on and surrounds our transit nodes. And so what RXR is currently doing in the suburbs is looking at suburban transit nodes where there's been underdevelopment, where there is vacant land, where you can develop to a level of affordability that people who are economically challenged can meet. And we're looking to work with municipalities in the suburbs to try to create significant amounts of housing. And so we're master developer in New Rochelle, where we recently entitled over 11 million square feet of new development, 5,500 new residential units. Yonkers, we're building a 440 unit new rental building. Stamford, we're building 325 units in a 25-story tower. Glen Cove, we're a master developer of a 56-acre waterfront site where we're breaking ground on 3 new buildings. Hempstead, Huntington Station, we're a master developer. This is an opportunity that not only is good for the region, but is one that can be good for developers. And I think that if we want to succeed as a region, developers and municipalities need to recognize that they need to be doing more of this. It's good for the region because it will eventually create more supply that will lower costs, and it's good for the municipalities as well because it will attract to them populations that currently they're having trouble attracting, especially young people and aging baby boomers.
Perfect. Well, look, you've given our audience a lot of great things to think about today, and just really appreciate your taking the time.
Thank you.
So that's it for this month, and look forward to being in touch.